If you saw my last video, we did an introduction to manual mode. To the brave few who made it through that, welcome back. Today, we're going to explore it a little farther and talk about the impact each of the three settings can have on your images. Part 1 on manual mode was a very basic introduction. We talked about how to put your camera in manual mode and how to adjust each setting independently using an entry-level DSLR like this Nikon D3400. If you missed that video and you've never tried manual mode at all, you might want to check it out. On the other hand, if you saw that video and did the exercises at the end, or if you've played around a little in manual mode on your own, you're ready for this video. So let's get started. You already know that manual mode gives you the opportunity to adjust all three components of the exposure triangle, and you use your camera's light meter to tell you when you have achieved a proper exposure. But what you might not realize, or maybe figured out during the exercises, is that each of the three settings can affect your picture in ways beyond just the exposure. This is where we move beyond the basic mechanics of manual and start to make some intentional adjustments that will give you more creative control of your images. Let's start with ISO. I like to start there because it's the most straightforward setting when it comes to how it affects your image. We already know from last time that a higher ISO number will give you a brighter exposure, but it has another effect on your picture as well, and that's noise. You may have seen this in some of your own images. If you've ever tried to take pictures in low light without using your flash, you probably noticed that some of the images looked kind of grainy. It's like there's a weird sandy texture overlaid on the image, and the colors may look weird as well. That's noise. Here's a photo I took with this D3400 at a relatively high ISO setting. You can see that there's a grainy look across the entire image and that it's usually most apparent in the shadows. So, the higher you raise your ISO, the more noise you'll have in the picture. Photo editing programs like Lightroom do feature noise reduction, and it does a decent job, but at the expense of sharpness. What does all this mean? Well, it means that in any given situation, you want to use the lowest ISO setting that will give you a proper exposure with the shutter speed and aperture you want to use. For that reason, when I'm shooting in manual mode, I usually adjust the ISO last. Here's a little side note. You may be taking a photo that you want to look a little gritty. Maybe it's something industrial or an urban street shot, and you want it to have that gritty texture, so you might think, I'll shoot with a high ISO. In most cases, I wouldn't recommend that. This is one instance where I would say you want to shoot the cleanest image you can in camera, and then achieve that look in post-production. The reason is that most photo editing software allows you to add some grain to an image. This is a better option because, one, you can control exactly how much of the effect you want, and two, because in post-processing, the effect is designed to emulate film grain, which is much more pleasing to the eye than digital noise. So, what about shutter speed? Your shutter speed is how long the shutter stays open to collect light. On most cameras, this ranges from 30 seconds to around 1/4000th of a second. The longer your shutter stays open, the more light it will collect and the brighter your exposure will be. But any movement that happens while the shutter is open will be recorded in the image as blur. And that applies to movement of your subject, movement in the background, and movement of the camera. This is where we get terms like motion blur and camera shake. So let's say you're taking photos of a fast-moving subject and you want that subject to be sharp. You need to use a fast shutter speed to freeze that motion. Or maybe your subject is fairly still, but there's low light and you're hand holding your camera. The human body can only hold the camera so still, and eventually you will hit a shutter speed that is so slow, the tiny movements of the camera while the shutter is open will show up as blur. Now, everyone's limit of handheld shooting is a little different, but as a beginner, with most lenses, I would say you don't want to go too much slower than about 1/125th for handheld shots. Image stabilization and improving your technique can bring that number much lower, but if you're just getting started and using an entry-level camera with a kit lens, that's a pretty good starting point. Feel free to experiment and see where your limit is. Here are some examples of bird photography where I had to use a very fast shutter speed to freeze the motion of the bird and keep my subject sharp. But sometimes our shutter speed choice can go the other way. Maybe you're set up on a tripod and you want some motion blur in something like the flow of a river. This is where you would intentionally choose a slower shutter speed for a particular reason. You won't get a shot like this in auto mode. Or maybe you want to take a nighttime shot. Nothing much is moving in the frame and you have a tripod or a steady place to set your camera down. You don't want to use a flash and you want a nice, clean, properly exposed photo of a night scene. Again, you would use a slow shutter speed for that effect. And finally, that brings us to aperture. And this is probably the most confusing setting for most beginners. The aperture actually exists in your lens, not your camera body, and it adjusts the size of the hole that light comes through to land on your sensor. Since this is a feature of the lens, different lenses will have different aperture settings available to use. But what they all have in common is that the larger the opening, the more light that comes in and the brighter your exposure will be. So what other effect does aperture have on your image? It's what we refer to as depth of field. When you focus your camera on a subject, the only thing the camera knows about your subject is how far away it is, and it's actually based on the distance from the camera sensor. Think of it this way. Your camera doesn't actually focus on things. It focuses at a specific distance. Anything that is exactly that distance from the sensor will be perfectly in focus. Depth of field refers to how far in front of and behind that focal distance will things still appear to be relatively in focus. I say relatively because there's not a clear demarcation between what's in focus and what's out of focus. It's a judgment call based on a scientific principle called, no shit, the circle of confusion. But since I don't want any of us circling the drain of confusion right now, that's all I'm going to say about it. Let's try to pull back to reality here. What does depth of field mean for your photos? The clearest example is something photographers talk about all the time. It's something that smartphones are trying desperately to imitate, and quite possibly what made you go out and spend a bunch of money on a DSLR in the first place. That awesome blurry background that makes your subject pop out and gives your photos that pleasing three-dimensional quality. And no, I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say the B word. I swear to you, I'm going to get through this entire discussion of aperture and depth of field without once saying the word ugh. So here's how you do it. And for me, the easiest way to remember it. Your aperture size is referred to in what are called f-stop numbers. The smaller the number, the larger the opening, and the brighter your exposure will be. But the easiest way to think about it in this case is the smaller the number, the fewer things at varying distances that will be in focus. Low f-stop number, low number of things in focus. High f-stop number, high number of things in focus. So let's take a portrait. You want your subject, and specifically your subject's eyes, to be in sharp focus, but you want the background to be nice and blurry to eliminate distractions and make your subject pop. You want to choose a lower f-stop number for a shallow depth of field. That means not many things in focus in front of or behind your focal distance. But you can also use this in the opposite way. Let's say you're taking a landscape image and you want everything to be in focus, from near to far. High number of things in focus, high f-stop number. So now we've covered all three camera settings and how they impact your photo beyond just the exposure. The trick now is to determine which one is most important for the particular image you want to take and then balance it with the other two to achieve a proper exposure. Do you want to use a low f-stop number for a shallow depth of field? Then you probably need a low ISO setting and a faster shutter speed so your picture isn't overexposed. Taking photos of a fast-moving subject? You need a fast shutter speed, so you might need to open up your aperture to a lower number and or raise your ISO so your image isn't underexposed. The key is to decide which of the three settings is most important for this particular photo, then let your light meter guide you to proper settings for the other two. Ready for some homework? Well, here you go. Take 3 photos in manual mode. Again, these don't need to be award-winning photos worthy of National Geographic. We're just practicing here. Take one photo of a fast-moving subject where you use a fast shutter speed to freeze the action. Second, take a photo with a shallow depth of field or a blurry background. And finally, take a low light photo without flash using the lowest ISO setting you can. Once you've done those three, experiment. Using unusual settings will give you unexpected results, and sometimes that can be fun too. Just go take pictures and have fun doing it.